A captured German staff officer sat in stunned silence as he counted. One American supply truck every 14 seconds, stretching to the horizon. More vehicles in a single convoy than his entire army group possessed. He'd spent years studying logistics at elite military schools, and by every scientific principle he knew, what he was witnessing was impossible. Yet it was feeding Patton's army as it raced 600 miles across France in 60 days. What did these untrained American truck drivers understand about war that Germany's best military minds had missed?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1944, the world was at war. German officers had spent years learning the art of moving armies across Europe. They studied in the finest schools, memorizing maps and calculating how many trains it took to feed a division. They believed their system was perfect, built on 200 years of Prussian military science. Supply depots were placed exactly where they needed to be. Rail lines connected everything like a spider's web. Every liter of fuel was accounted for in thick ledgers. This was how civilized nations fought wars, they told themselves, with mathematics and precision. Hauptmann Klaus Brenner was one of these officers. He had graduated near the top of his class at Staff College, where instructors taught him that logistics was the backbone of victory. His friend, Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann, was younger but shared the same training, the same confidence. Together, they had watched the German war machine roll across Poland and France with mechanical efficiency. Everything moved on schedule, everything had its place. Then came Normandy, and the world turned upside down. By late August, both men found themselves prisoners, captured near the Falaise pocket, where thousands of German soldiers had been trapped like fish in a net. They were loaded onto American trucks, hands-bound, uniforms dirty and torn. The truck bounced along a road that had been cratered by bombs and hastily repaired. Brenner stared out the back, trying to understand what he was seeing. Trucks, endless trucks. They stretched in both directions as far as his eyes could follow, a green river of canvas and steel flowing eastward. Every truck was packed with supplies. Jerry cans of fuel, wooden crates of ammunition, sacks of flour, spare tires stacked like towers. The convoy never stopped. Brenner began counting in his head, timing the intervals. Every 14 seconds, another truck passed going the opposite direction, returning empty to fetch more supplies. Hoffmann leaned close and whispered in German, "Where are the trains? Where are the supply depots? This is madness." Brenner nodded slowly, his mind racing through everything he had been taught. You could not sustain an army this way. It violated every principle. Trucks were for short hauls, for filling gaps. Trains were for real logistics, for moving the tonnage an army needed. Yet here were the Americans doing the impossible with nothing but trucks and painted signs. Their guard, a young private who spoke no German, noticed them staring. He grinned and said something they did not understand, but his hand swept proudly at the convoy. Brenner felt something cold settle in his stomach. This crude system, this improvised chaos, was feeding the American advance, and the Americans were winning. The prisoner of war camp sat near the front lines, close enough that Brenner could hear distant artillery at night. The Americans kept them fed and gave them work details that followed the rules of war. Brenner watched everything with the eyes of a trained officer, collecting information like a man assembling a puzzle. He listened to guards talking. He counted vehicles driving past. He studied the supply routes painted on signs along the roads. The numbers he calculated made no sense, yet they were real. 6,000 trucks operated day and night without stopping. The guards called it the Red Ball Express, a name painted on signs marking the one-way route. 12,500 tons of supplies moved east every single day. Just to General Patton's Third Army alone, 900,000 gallons of gasoline flowed forward. Brenner did the math in his head over and over, checking his work. By German doctrine, this would require 47 train loads per day, 18 established depots positioned at precise intervals, and 6 weeks of careful preparation. The Americans were doing it with trucks driven by men who often had only 4 hours of sleep before climbing back behind the wheel for another 20-hour shift. Many of the drivers were black soldiers, men the Nazi propaganda had taught Brenner to dismiss as inferior. Yet here they were, moving more supplies than the entire Wehrmacht logistics corps. One morning, the prisoners received their rations. Hoffman opened his package and froze. Inside the small cardboard box were cigarettes, a chocolate bar, powdered coffee that dissolved in water, and even toilet paper. Hoffman held up the chocolate, turning it over in his hands like it was made of gold. "Klaus," he whispered, "this is what they give their prisoners. What do you think their own soldiers are eating?" Brenner had no answer. He had seen captured German supply records. Wehrmacht forward units received 70 pounds of supplies per soldier per day. The Americans received 66 pounds, almost the same amount. But the Americans were racing forward 50 miles a day, while German forces retreated on foot, often going hungry. During a work detail at a supply depot, Brenner met one of the drivers. Corporal Marcus Johnson was checking the oil on his truck, a GMC that soldiers called a Jimmy. Through a translator, Johnson explained he had just finished a 72-hour run, navigating bombed roads without proper maps, following only the painted red ball signs and his own determination. Brenner stared at this tired man with oil on his hands. "You are not even trained logistics personnel?" he asked. Johnson smiled slightly. "Trained enough. Got Patton's boys their gas, didn't I?" At that moment, something cracked in Brenner's understanding. American logistics was not about science or elegance. It was about having more of everything and the raw will to move it forward no matter what stood in the way.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By October, Brenner had been assigned to help organize prisoner labor at a massive supply depot. The Geneva Convention allowed this as long as the work was not connected to combat. At first, Brenner thought this would be simple warehouse duty. Instead, he walked into something that shattered everything he thought he understood about war. Stacks of tires rose 3 stories high, thousands upon thousands of them arranged in perfect rows. Jerry cans, the very design the Germans had invented, sat in mountains that seemed to have no end. A refrigerated truck rumbled past, and Brenner learned it was delivering ice cream to soldiers at the front lines. Ice cream! His own troops back home were rationing bread, eating sawdust mixed into their flour to make it stretch further. The Americans were bringing frozen desserts to a battlefield. Captain Jim Dawson ran the depot with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never known scarcity. He noticed Brenner watching the operation and approached him one afternoon. "So, what do they teach you at your fancy staff colleges?" Dawson asked, genuinely curious. Brenner straightened, his pride still intact despite his circumstances. "Efficiency, precision. We calculated every liter of fuel, every kilogram of ammunition. We built the finest logistics system in military history." Dawson nodded thoughtfully, then gestured at the chaos around them. Trucks came and went without formal paperwork. Sergeants waved vehicles through based on urgent need rather than careful schedules. "And yet here we are," Dawson said. "You know why this works? We didn't have time for perfection. We had stuff, lots of stuff, and men willing to drive till they drop." That night, Brenner couldn't sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, his mind racing.
Everything he had studied, all those years of training, had taught him that wars were won through superior planning and efficient use of limited resources. But America had rewritten the rules. They won with overwhelming abundance, with production lines that made trucks faster than Germany could destroy them. Ford and General Motors built 5,000 trucks every single month. Patton's army burned more fuel in 1 week than the entire Wehrmacht had in reserve. The Americans treated trucks like disposable tools. If one broke down, they left it on the roadside and took another. There were always more. Brenner pulled out a scrap of paper and began writing, the words flowing from a place of painful honesty. I have spent my career studying the great German military thinkers, but America taught me something new. Quantity has a quality all its own. They did not outthink us. They outproduced us. And perhaps most disturbing, they did it with men we were taught to dismiss. The Negro soldiers of the Red Ball Express showed more determination than any logistics corps in our army. What else were we wrong about? He folded the paper carefully, a confession he would carry for the rest of his life. Brenner returned to Germany in the spring of 1946. The train crawled through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Every city was broken. Frankfurt was rubble. Cologne was ashes. His hometown had been bombed so many times that he barely recognized the streets where he had played as a child. Women in torn coats picked through bricks, salvaging anything useful. A single loaf of bread cost millions of marks, paper money so worthless that people used it to start fires for warmth. He walked past what had been his neighborhood and saw a German supply truck, abandoned and rusting, its tires stolen long ago. Next to it sat a warehouse where American relief trucks were parked in neat rows. GMC Jimmies, the same trucks that had carried supplies to Patton's army, now brought food to feed starving Germans. The irony burned like acid in his throat. The same vehicles he had watched roll past him as a prisoner now kept his countrymen alive. Children lined up with empty bowls, waiting for soup kitchens run by American soldiers. Old men who had once worn Wehrmacht uniforms now depended on the charity of their former enemies. Brenner walked through the distribution center, watching young American privates hand out rations with casual efficiency. They worked quickly, without ceremony, treating the task like any other job. No speeches, no lectures about defeat, just food moving from trucks to hungry people, the same way supplies had moved to the front lines 2 years earlier. One afternoon, Brenner visited an old colleague from Staff College who now worked coordinating Marshall Plan logistics. They stood together watching American convoys unload sacks of flour and powdered milk. His friend turned to him with hollow eyes. "Klaus, you studied logistics your whole life. Why could we not do what they did?" Brenner was quiet for a long time before answering. "We had the knowledge. They had factories. We had the doctrine. They had the trucks. We calculated what was necessary. They built what was possible, then doubled it." His friend nodded slowly, understanding the terrible truth. Germany had fought an industrial war with an agricultural economy. America had fought with the power of a continent that could not be bombed, could not be starved, could not be stopped. They walked to a cafe that had reopened in a half-destroyed building. Real coffee was impossible to find, so they drank chicory mixed with hot water and pretended it tasted like the old days. Brenner's friend pulled out a folder of papers, reports he had been studying about American wartime production. The numbers were staggering. In 4 years, American factories had built 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million trucks. 2 million! Germany's entire truck production for the whole war had been less than 400,000, and most of those had been lost on the Eastern Front. "Do you know what haunts me?" his friend asked quietly. We knew these numbers during the war. Our intelligence services reported them. But we told ourselves they must be exaggerated. Propaganda. No nation could produce like that. Except they did. Brenner thought about the ice cream trucks he had seen, the mountains of supplies, the casual way American sergeants treated equipment as disposable. We built beautiful machines, he said. Precise engines, perfect gearboxes. Each truck was a work of engineering art. They built simple machines that worked well enough, and they built them faster than we could count them. His friend smiled bitterly. Good enough is better than perfect when you can make 10 of them in the time it takes us to make one. The years rolled forward like those endless convoys. Brenner found work, remarried, had children in the new Germany that rose from the ashes. He watched his country rebuild, saw the Marshall Plan transform rubble into cities again. American money flowed like the supplies had to Patton, and German industry learned new lessons about efficiency and scale. The old Prussian ways of doing things faded, replaced by methods that valued speed and volume over perfection. Brenner saw his former colleagues struggle with this change. They had been trained to think one way their entire lives, and now the world demanded something different.
By the 1960s, Brenner taught logistics at a rebuilt university. His office was small but neat, filled with books and maps. On his desk sat a single photograph in a simple frame. It showed a Red Ball Express convoy stretching to the horizon, trucks bumper to bumper carrying the war forward. Students sometimes asked about it. One young man, born after the war ended, pointed at the photo during office hours. "Herr Professor, why do you keep that picture?" Brenner picked up the frame, studying the image he had looked at thousands of times. To remember that wars are not won by the most brilliant staff officers. They are won by nations that can produce 500,000 trucks and find men brave enough to drive them through hell. The Red Ball Express was not elegant. It was effective. That is the only measurement that matters in war. The student leaned closer, curious now. "But sir, I read that the Red Ball Express was inefficient, that it wasted fuel and wore out vehicles too quickly." Brenner set down the photo and looked at the young man with patient eyes. Yes, it was inefficient by our standards. A single truck might drive 400 miles to deliver supplies that could have gone 200 miles by train, if trains had been available. Tires wore out in weeks instead of months. Fuel consumption was enormous. By every metric we use to judge logistics, it should have failed. He paused, letting the weight of the next words settle. But it did not fail. It succeeded beyond anything we thought possible, because the Americans understood something we did not. They had enough trucks that inefficiency did not matter. They had enough fuel that waste was acceptable. They had enough drivers that exhaustion could be managed in shifts. They scaled up so large that our definitions of waste became meaningless. The student nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So the lesson is to have more resources than you need?" Brenner shook his head. "The lesson is that having resources means nothing if you cannot move them where they are needed when they are needed. The Red Ball Express moved 412,000 tons of supplies in 81 days. That sustained the fastest military advance in history. Those drivers, many of them men facing prejudice even in their own army, performed a miracle of determination. They did not do it perfectly, they did it successfully. Learn the difference." He set the photo down carefully. In his mind, he could still see those endless convoys rolling past and could still hear the rumble of engines that never stopped. Patton's thunder run to the Rhine had been sustained by men the world tried to forget, driving improvised routes through impossible conditions. German officers had mocked it as chaos, but it was Germany that had failed to understand modern war's true foundation.
Industrial might and human will combined in quantities that could not be calculated in any staff college textbook. Brenner had learned this lesson as a prisoner, watching a system that should not work accomplish what perfect planning could not. He would spend the rest of his life making sure others understood it too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.